Welcome everyone. Welcome to MDIC's External Evidence Methods EEM Framework webinar. I would recommend all the participants to mute your microphone and utilize the Q&A option on the bottom of the Zoom screen to type in your questions, and our panelist speakers will be available at the end for the discussion. Our plan is to have approximately 30 minutes presentation and leave at least last 30 minutes for discussion about the questions from the audience. Before just diving into the actual presentation, I just want to give folks who are new to this platform, MDIC platform, a very brief one-slide overview about MDIC. MDIC is a non-profit public-private partnership which is focusing on advancing regulatory science for devices and diagnostics. We have a member organization which is comprised of, as shown here, medical device industry, government stakeholders, particularly FDA, CMS, NIH, CDC, and BARDA. And we also have patients and patient advocacy groups, providers, and academic institutes, as well as hospital networks as non-profit members of MDIC. We specifically work on regulatory science in the pre-competitive space, not on the advocacy and lobbying. As you can see here, we have numerous projects across the TPLC side of the devices and diagnostics. And those who are new to MDIC platform, we do recommend to visit www.mdic.org to see a wide variety of projects, early feasibility studies, cybersecurity, case for quality, real-world evidence, and so on. There are so many different projects. And majority of the resources and tools are available freely to the stakeholders or to our community. So I would definitely encourage you to check our website. Today, we are specifically focusing on the external evidence methods, which is a part of the real-world evidence or real-world data concepts here. We have an amazing panel of speakers here. We have Pablo Morales, who is the Chief Medical Officer from Cdrh. We have Ted Listic from Medtronic, Lily Yu again from Cdrh OPEC, and Vandana Bhatia is also from Cdrh. Just one change, Daniel Canos had a last minute change in priorities, and he has to, he could not join today's session as announced previously. So Pablo is going to help us with the discussion. So this is the team who is helping us, helping MDIC with the framework, the EEM framework. And I can't have a better array of speakers or a subject matter expert to explain the details of the framework. With that, I will turn to Pablo to give FDA perspectives on real-world evidence or real-world data, as well as how it is connected to the EEM framework. Pablo.
Thank you very much, Jitesh, and good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna try to put the external evidence methodology into context when it fits into the FDA clinical evidence generation and NEST. So I am Pablo Morales. I am the Chief Medical Officer of the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis at the Center for Devices at the FDA. And I will be providing Cdrh perspective on clinical evidence generation, discussing its use in regulatory decision-making and FDA role in the wider stakeholder community. Next slide, please. Cdrh has been actively engaged in improving upon the clinical trial ecosystem for a decade. Recognizing the challenges with conducting clinical trials, we had strengthening the clinical trial enterprise, and we made that a center strategic priority. We established a clinical trials program and director, which is now rolling through what today is the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, or OCEA. And we have worked with the multi-stakeholders community on programs such as External Evidence Methods Group and the establishment of the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, all aimed at more efficiently generating clinical evidence. Next slide. Cdrh has implemented processes and collaborated externally to streamline and support innovation as part of clinical evidence generation through legislative, policy, and guidance activities, improving regulatory efficiencies and predictability, developing the Medical Device Innovation Consortium Early Feasibility Studies Clinical Trial Site Network, collaborating on the in silico clinical trials, supporting real-world data collection and analysis, and last but not least, awarding a collaborative agreement to establish the next coordinating center. Next, please. So now I'm going to highlight some of these specific efforts. The MDIC Early Feasibility Studies Working Group is a great collaboration among the EFS ecosystem between industry, investigators, and clinical sites. Through this, we have test-driven tools to increase the efficiency of the EFS STAR process, and all of the contributions from FDA working to achieve the Cdrh vision that patients in the United States have access to high quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. So this tied back to Cdrh mission. Next, please. The in silico trials work leverage physics-based computational models and simulations of the device functioning between beating human hearts and constructed to represent a virtual patient population. And this is briefly outlined in this slide. Next. Another effort relates to external evidence method, which is the reason why we're hosting this webinar today with the MDIC. The MDIC external evidence method was initiated in 2019 with the aim of establishing a more predictable pathway for use of external evidence method. So the group has to innovate by combining both Frequentist and Bayesian methodologies, and also catalog existing methods for evidence fusion from data external to a clinical trial. Next. The need for this flexibility is built into our regulation in describing what we may consider as valid scientific evidence to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for marketing. Our regulation considers many different types of studies and data as supportive evidence. And so we have been well situated to accept real world evidence for many years. Next. Real world data, as we know, can come from different sources. These include diagnostic lab and imaging data, unique device identification data, patient and device generated data, electronic health record, and medical billing claims. Next. So the question arises, why use RWE and RWD in regulatory decisions when traditional clinical trials allow us to evaluate device performance in controlled clinical setting? Next slide, please. Why? Because there are benefits of clinical trial. You can control over the study design and protocol, and you can control for confounding. However, there are several limitations of clinical trials, and these are usually expensive and time consuming, may be difficult to collect rare outcomes, and the generalizability of the results is also challenging. Next, please. So there are potential benefits and a good opportunity to capitalize in RWD because we will have a better understanding of device performance in the real world environment, which can further inform the benefit risk profile. Also facilitation of the collection of outcomes, not always feasible in traditional clinical trials, such as performance in diverse patient population or subgroups, long-term outcomes, and the ability to assess rarer outcomes as a result of tapping into much larger data sets. Also, opportunities to partner with patients in new ways that we haven't done before by patient-reported outcomes, medical mobile apps, wearable devices, user experience, among others. And finally, reduce time and cost to answer the important questions so that we can tie back to that Cdrh mission that I highlighted earlier in my presentation. Next. So the next coordinated center, a strong and growing network of collaborators enable access to a wide swath of evidence from clinical experience, which can be harnessed to support regulatory submissions. The network institutions have access to robust data, organizing through standardized common data models. And today, there are currently 15 network collaborators representing over 141 million lives. Next. In 2018, the journey of the NEST Coordinated Center established multi-stakeholder subcommittees to support its effort to conduct real-world evidence studies for medical devices. This resulted in NEST CC publishing the methods, frameworks, delineating the key components of a study protocol for the evaluation of medical devices, and the data quality framework covering the data governance, the characteristics, how to capture the transformation and the curation of this data. And all this was published in February of last year, and the leaders for these two efforts were highlighted on the slide. Next. So with the launch of NEST version 1.0, this large research network of real-world data and expert investigators across the ecosystem is open to the medical devices stakeholder community at large. This is an exciting time for real-world data and real-world evidence, and for leveraging external evidence. Next. So having its start in 2019, this draft framework document established a more predictable pathway for the use of external evidence methods, such as new, innovative Frequentist and Bayesian methods to support regulatory medical device decisions and other stakeholder decisions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. Now we'll have Lily.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lily Yu. I'm Deputy Director, Division of Biostatistics in Cdrh. So today I'm going to briefly discuss EEM program. Next one, please. So as Pablo indicated, the EEM program was established last year, and a survey, EEM survey, was issued in June last year to collect information from industry. A draft of EEM framework document was completed in January this year. Now it's open for public comments until February 2nd. The framework is intended to provide a practical guide for the design, analysis, and evaluation of clinical evidence generated through TPLC of medical devices and diagnostics when leveraging external data sources. Therefore, to help to facilitate innovations in medical device development and regulatory decision-making. Next one, please. So the framework catalogs different sources of external data and some traditional or novel statistical methods that can be considered to leverage external data. It also provides some real examples to illustrate the application of different statistical methods when leveraging external data. Next one, please. External data refer to data external to the planned clinical study. External evidence is a clinical evidence generated from external data through appropriate analysis. Next one, please. So here are some examples for external data source. Historical clinical study data, where usually patient level data are available, including baseline coverage and clinical outcomes. Medical device registry, lab test database, EHR, and simulated data from mathematical modeling. Next one, please. Okay, potential use of external data. From regulatory, from statistical point of view, external data could be used to generate hypotheses to be tested in a prospective clinical study could be used to establish performance goal or objective performance criteria for a single arm study, to generate a Bayesian prior for the current study, and to construct investigational device arm and or control arm. Also, they can be used to augment investigational device arm and or control arm in a comparative study. Next one, please. Regulatory considerations. From regulatory perspectives, external evidence could be used for approval or clearance of a new device. Indication expansion for a device already on the market. Evaluation of long-term safety and effectiveness, as well as safety signal detection. There are some important regulatory considerations. Prior to leveraging external data, it's essential to confirm the external data are fit for purpose, which refers to relevance and reliability of external data. In many cases, when designing a study, external data have been already collected and clinical outcomes are available already. So it's very important to ensure the scientific validity of study design and the interpretability of study results. Therefore, consistent, predictable, transparent, and science-based regulatory decisions can be made. Next one, please. Okay, now statistical method for leveraging external evidence. In this document, you see now talk about different statistical methods, including propensity score methods such as propensity score matching or propensity score stratification. Bayesian inference such as Bayesian hierarchical model and Bayesian power prior method. Propensity score integrated power prior approaches and propensity score integrated composite likelihood approaches. Next one, please. Okay, here are two real examples. Number one, hardware, which is a first generation device. It was evaluated through a comparative study with a control arm constructed from patient registry. The statistical method used there is a propensity score stratification. The second example is a drug-eluting stent, which is a first generation device as well. External data source is historical clinical studies, which were used to augment both investigational device arm and control arm. The statistical method used is a Bayesian hierarchical model. Next one, please. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit more about propensity score integrated approaches. It's a new methodology in both Bayesian and frequentist settings. We developed these methods for leveraging RWD to augment a prospective investigational study and potentially reduce the size, duration, and cost of the clinical study. They can be used to augment a single-arm investigational study with RWD or augment a control arm or treatment arm or both of RCT. They have an option of downweighting information from RWD when necessary. They can be used for both therapeutic devices and diagnostic tests. Next slide, please. More importantly, the methods can separate study design and outcome data analysis, which ensure the integrity and the transparency of study design and enhance the interpretability of study results. They can be used for prospectively designed clinical studies in pre-market, post-approval, and post-market surveillance settings. Therefore, it helps streamline clinical evidence generation across the TPLC and speed up medical device development and regulatory decision-making. I'd like to remind you, the EEM framework document is open now, but will close on February 22nd. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lily. Now we'll turn over to Ted Listig. Ted.
Great, thank you. So I really enjoyed the prior presentations by my team members, Pablo and Lily. Great presentations, enjoy that. And I'm going to give a complimentary view here as well. So I'll be talking about examples and methods for external evidence. Next slide, please. So the concept here, this is just another way of talking about what exactly we're working with external data. And this is data generated outside of a contemporaneous clinical study, whether it's historical clinical trial data, modeling and simulation, using registries, electronic health records, maybe administrative data like claims. Certainly, there's a lot of emphasis these days on real-world data and real-world evidence. And a subset of external data falls into that category. But part of the reason why we took the effort to put this working group together was we felt there was space to talk about a broadening of those considerations. How you work with outside data isn't necessarily a function just of whether or not it's real world, it's that it's an external data source. When we're talking about external data, we're usually considering this combination then of that external information with some currently generated clinical study information, at least for this working group. And as indicated, there are many documents, great documents have been developed through the center, for example, the various guidance documents, how one can work with those purely external data sources. Here we're focusing on the mixture. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic I've put together, and it's busy on purpose, right? Where I'm trying to sort of indicate all the different ways in which you could have different sources of information. So, starting with the outline of the person, I'm going blue and yellow. So for two different arms in a trial, you've got those large person outlines for traditional clinical trial patient data. There's also smaller versions of that off to the left, and that's to indicate, well, that could actually be coming from historical trial data. But then below the individuals in the main body, you could have data coming from your implantable active device. You could have it coming from, some wearable external device. Maybe there's a PRO, using your cell phone to answer questions. Maybe you're pulling information from electronic health records or billing records, or maybe the monitor on the left for the modeling and simulation, right? These are all different types and classes of information that could be used in an analysis of data about patients in a trial. In some cases, this is just another channel to get information. It's certainly not new to incorporate data from, PROs into a clinical trial, but this is just to get people to think about how could we categorize the source of information. Next slide, please. So probably the most common type of example that we've seen where people have talked about what are submissions that they have completed has to do with have just a single active arm gathered prospectively matched against a historical data, right? So you've got your blue data you're getting now, and you're comparing that in some way against data from historical trials, from the yellow arms. And the historical trial could also be from a registry. It doesn't have to be trial data, for example, right? And you might combine that through an objective performance criteria, performance goal, using propensity score matching, what have you. So it's quite common. We saw this quite a lot in the survey. Next slide, please. Then what we see too is I'm going to talk a little bit about other ways in which you could bring in the data. So this is an allusion to the fact that there has been in the past some really good working groups that we've had. Partnership, for example, that involved MDIC, multiple companies, including Medtronic, FDA staff, put together this resulting in an example of this paper about the incorporation of stochastic engineering models as prior information in Bayesian medical device trials. Right, this is a concept of how you could have a framework for pulling in data into a study. So we did this workshop in April 2018, where we talked a lot about it, and it is sort of like the earliest iteration of the types of advances that Lily was talking about. Those are more refined versions than what was first started here. Next slide, please. So one way in which you can work with that clinical study with the historical data, we had worked with our spiral study. This has to do with treatment-resistant hypertension. And in this case, we were generating data from within a trial. So we had that blue and the yellow subjects, but we also had information from something you could view as sort of a pilot phase trial, those smaller subjects on the left, that contributed to the overall analysis in a structured way, using the method that had been outlined in the prior slide, right? So this again is an example of external evidence that was generated prior to the current study, for which there's a structured means to bring an overall analysis together. Now, this particular one doesn't show up in our survey document because our survey talks about things that have been completed, right? This is something that's underway. And the part of the reason we're talking about this is to encourage developers to consider the various ways in which they could leverage data. Next slide, please. Another approach, and here we've got some interesting formatting going on, that's fine. We all can kind of figure out what's going on. Within our diabetes business, the group has expressed interest in exploring alternative study designs. And we know in that business that there's going to be improvements both on the algorithm side and on the sensor side. So what's a way in which we could have a framework for bringing all that data together? Well, it turns out that when you start talking about the artificial pancreas and you start talking about a closed loop system to deal with that, the decisions for how you give insulin in response to a glucose measurement, well, behind the scenes there's virtual patients being used to sort of say, in a hypothetical situation, what would you do? Well, it makes sense to incorporate that not only for the development of the algorithm, but as a complement to clinical study data to evaluate the program. So next slide, please. So, within the virtual patient project, there's this idea that you would take, again, data from a clinical trial, but this time, instead of combining it with prior clinical trial data, you're combining it with modeling and simulation information, that pictogram of the computer monitor in the upper left-hand side. So it's this virtual patient strategy in the diabetes space, leveraging the fact that we have this large pool, thousands of virtual patients that were developed from real data. So again, this is a different way, doesn't have to be real data, of pulling in outside relevant information to a planned and structured analysis to describe what was going on in full. Next slide, please. So we know that there's a variety of methods that have previously been used to support regulatory decisions based on external evidence. Certainly everyone's very familiar with the idea of performance goals or objective performance criteria. Lots of variations for propensity score matching and weighting or stratification. We know about Bayesian hierarchical modeling, the Bayesian commensurate prior, but there's other stuff coming up as well that we anticipate could be successful as well. Things like cardinality matching as opposed to propensity score matching, it's variation. Using a discount power prior approach. The integrated power composite likelihood approach, as Lily was talking about. The survey that we conducted and have summarized in the document is useful for sort of this inclusive documentation sense. So it describes things that have happened. And it's useful for, again, as a document to refer to. It's like, this is something that has occurred. But this survey isn't exhaustive. We fully anticipate that there's other stuff going on, especially in the development phase, that people chose not to disclose. But we believe it is helpful for persons to have access to things that have gone through the approval process already, to understand that, yes, in fact, there does exist an established regulatory pathway for evaluating analyses of this type. Next slide, please. So in my conclusion, the concept of working with multiple sources of information is not new. There's many established methods for doing this. But even so, there's still room for new methods development or for application of unusual existing approaches. It seems that for many sponsors, some of these challenges in leveraging the external evidence may be more related to non-methods questions. How do you identify the right data source? How do you ensure that that data source has the necessary relevance and reliability to be used for the basis of regulatory decision-making? How do you gain alignment that the proposal you want is appropriate for a particular regulatory decision? The framework that we've developed here provides this useful reference of past successes and future possibilities. Because what we're trying to get to as a community is to make progress when we can share pre-competitively lessons learned and make improvements to the process of using the external information. So, the framework that we've set out, again, is primarily a description of what has happened and sort of, ideas of what you could do in the future. It's not going down point by point and saying, here is all the pros and cons of particular methods. It's a starter, right? It's a primer. It gets you going. So I see that there's a question that came in about, what are the limitations or caveats for the framework? And the framework is more a description of what is going on as opposed to an instruction manual. So hopefully that'll help. And with that, I'll wrap up. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it off to Vandana.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah,
thank you, Jitesh. We had 3 wonderful speakers. Thank you, Pablo, Lily, and Ted for highlighting the external evidence methods effort. It was truly a team effort. It was led by Jitesh from MDIC under FDA's leadership from Dr. Ram Tiwari, Dr. Lily Yu, Dr. Yongling Xu, Dr. Hingley, and Dr. Nelson Liu, as well as Dr. Cheng Hong Song from FDA, who all contributed to this effort. And of course, from industry side, we had Dr. Ted Lissick from Medtronic contributing to the writing of the EEM framework document, as well as getting input from Dr. Tim Hansen, as well as Dr. Brad Carlin. So truly a team effort where FDA, MDIC, and industry collaborated to put together this framework document. And as Ted very nicely said it's a primer, it's the start. It's showing and depicting some of the examples. It has included in it 7 examples of past studies that actually leveraged external data and either received approval or indication expansion using some of the methods that have been highlighted in the framework document. So it's a start, but I think it really provides a step forward for the medical device community to be able to navigate their way through different aspects of leveraging data from sources that are external to planned clinical studies. And with this, I would like to actually now open the floor and take any question and answers we have from our audience. So while we're waiting on that, I think I'd like to just start by maybe asking a question myself. Here we have we have innovative as well as traditional statistical methods outlined. One question I would like to ask Dr. Lily Yu is, would you have any advice from our FDA's perspective for sponsors when they're considering to use some of these methods for, say, for a first-of-a-kind type of device submission? Lily?
Yes, okay, good question, Vandana. Before I answer that question, I'd like to let you know, with the FDA, Vandana is a leader. She has been doing so well, making so many contributions to this effort. Okay, thank you, Vandana. So that's a very good question. So generally speaking, for a first-of-a-kind device, so ideally, RCT can provide strongest level of evidence. But at the same time, if you have relevant external data, you may want to think about it, whether it's appropriate to leverage those external data. So I have said that, I'd like to suggest you to have early interactions with the FDA. So working with the FDA together, figure out whether the quality of data are good enough, whether the reliability of data is sufficient, whether external data fit for purpose. So yeah, that's the first step we'd like to have. After that, we may together think about what kind of a statistical methods that would be appropriate for leveraging external data for your study. So yeah, the bottom line is early communication with FDA is essential. Get back to you. Yeah, Pablo, do you want to add your thoughts, if any?
Thank you, Lily. No, I think I was going to say the last comment. I think early communication is critical. I think when you're trying to think outside the box or when you're trying to utilize a new methodology, as Ted alluded, I think there is a lot of things that have been already been done that people may not be aware of. And I think by having that conversation at front and early, come early and come often is the way we see at the FDA, because if we work together, we have a higher chance of success to get that a safe and effective device to the final line in a more timely fashion. So I think asking the question whether this given data set or this approach will work early, it will be very important, not just from the statistical and methodological perspective, but also from the device review perspective. And I think industry tends to concentrate in device design and engineer question and put the statistic in the back burner until the device is correct. And I think the process doesn't need to be separate and keep be done together if you're thinking in an innovative way, so that when that device design is in a prototype ready for clinical use, in a clinical study, I mean, you already have figured out the statistics and the methodology, so you're saving time in the research pipeline to get the device safe and effective to the final line. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily and Pablo, for your great answer to the question. Certainly, early interaction with FDA is critical, and we have the QSUB process there to help sponsors interact with FDA early on to develop clinical protocols. So thank you for your answers. So we do have questions coming in here through our Q&A. So I would take, so there's one question, and I think I'll open it to the floor to our panelists for this. It's stated that our newer methods of comparative effectiveness, such as MAICs, matching adjusted indirect comparisons, or simulated treatment comparisons being considered?
So I can take that.
Okay, sure.
So
Thank
as
you.
it turns out, Tim Hansen on my team and Eric Barrett within our health economics outcomes research team in Medtronic, both were closely involved. We had a request like this that came up for MAIC. So it was coming from a external reimbursement body that had said they wanted this particular means of analysis used to summarize how well a particular product is working. And I'll give you the spoiler alert. Our essential findings is, yes, we were able to execute what they asked for, but it's not really a great method. So it's I'll just sort of give my own assessment that yes, there's lots of methods out there. You just got to be careful to make sure you're using the right tool for the right application. This particular one, I think, probably is going to be more relevant for those questions where you're not trying to establish the safety and efficacy so much as the overall a certain type of possibly reimbursement benefit risk profile. Certainly the FDA is also interested in benefit risk, but not usually from the pecuniary aspect of going with the monetary considerations. But broadly speaking, are other means of analysis appropriate? Well, sure. Like this framework isn't something we've said, these are the only 5 methods available. We have highlighted ones that we think are of main interest right now, where there's activity going on. In some cases where we could tie to work that was in progress or that people had considered, but certainly this is not meant to say that if it doesn't appear in the document, it can't be used. So my take on this would be, again, it's something that's available, would certainly be subject to consideration, but you would absolutely want to follow up on those comments we heard from Lily and Pablo that have those conversations with the FDA early and often to see the extent to which something like this might be appropriate for your own submission.
Thank you, Ted. There's another question here which is asking, will FDA Cdrh consider to require EEM in the submission in the future? My first take on this is it's not a requirement. I think it's a stepping stone towards saying, okay, you have external data that you may be able to utilize. If it fits for purpose, then it's a way to be able to speed up the process to bring the safe and new effective devices to the market sooner. So it's just providing you some information on what methods are there are out there and what examples of where those methods have already been applied. So it's just giving you that framework to be able to utilize and leverage external data into a clinical study that you may be planning going forward for your particular device. So with that, would anybody else have any comments to add to it for this question?
You said about it's not required.
Right. Thank you.
I think the clarification is we do not require. I think we are giving this as an alternative so that a given manufacturer can support that there is valid scientific data to support the labeling application of a given device. And as I said, that definition is flexible. And what we're trying to do here is, well, if your data is relevant and reliable, and you can use an external database to get to the valid scientific definition as per the CFR, FDA will consider. But we're not going to require, we're not going to mandate any of this. I think that we are just outlining some tools and resources that are important for you to consider because not always a clinical trial is the answer. That said, if the data is not relevant and reliable, and the external evidence methodology is not scientifically sounded, then we may need a prospective clinical trial. So we are here just to illustrate this is a different options, that different tools can be used for different things, and we are here to facilitate that conversation. Thank you.
Well, let me just mention one thing too, that I think,
yeah, please.
Yeah, so if the FDA had this great guidance document that came out a couple of years ago around pivotal study design, right? Where it talked about whether you're working with RCTs, all the way down to case reports, what have you. And some of the, what you can infer from that discussion is that there are times when different study designs would be more or less appropriate, right? You're not always going to be in the case where you can adequately perform blinding, where you really can have a blinded RCT. Sometimes that can happen. Or maybe you're working in the diagnostic space where it's not as relevant to have two parallel sets of samples whom you're applying a diagnostic measure to. It's actually better to have a single sample that you split and then apply two different measures to, right? So like even when you're talking about different measures of studies, it's critical to think about what are the constraints around the therapy or the product that you're working with to see what is most appropriate. And just to underscore, yeah, it's like these are the conversations we're having to find out which one's most relevant for the scientific question that needs to be addressed.
Great. Thank you, Ted. There's a question specifically for Medtronic. So Ted, if you would like to take that. Sure. Can you please clarify the term virtual patient, and is the data generated from individual patients? Are there issues with obtaining this patient data OUS where data privacy laws might be different?
Great, thanks for that. And I'm going to start off by giving Jitesh a heads up. I'm going to ask him to comment a little bit about the prior working group that existed before ours that did some work with virtual patients. So if you can comment on that in a moment. But broadly speaking, when we're talking about the virtual patients and the data involved there, sure, it's a fair question. Like, are you actually having information that could be traced back to a particular patient? And this brings up the concepts of anonymized or pseudo-anonymized or what have you. When we're working here in the virtual patient, what you're doing is you're taking an aspect of true biological performance derived from an individual, but you have broken the tie back to a site or a name or the things that you would need in order to identify to an individual patient level. The data came from a single individual, but you can't find out who it was. Right. So to the extent that that has been done adequately, that's usually how you would address these concerns with HIPAA or with GDPR or your various requirements. So when I talk about virtual patients in this framework, I'm talking about data that was generated by originally working with individual patients, but for whom we've split it and we've separated it from our ability to track and identify by name or site the patient that was originally involved with that. And Jitesh, if now you could comment just a little bit about the prior work that MDIC had done in that virtual patient work.
Yeah, so I'm not subject matter expert, but there was one of the important projects or earlier project at MDIC was on the virtual patient modeling. And what we demonstrated was taking a specific example. In that case, in this particular case, ICD lead, we demonstrated that, as Ted mentioned, we can actually augment a submission or a clinical trial data with the simulated data by this methodology, virtual patient methodology, along with utilizing powerful statistical tools. For example, in this particular case, Bayesian statistics. So we demonstrated using a very specific example, and the tools and resources, let it be our package or the statistical methodology, they're all available in the public domain. And even to make sure that this particular methodology can really go through the FDA review process, we also did something unique at that point of time called a mock submission. So we had our working group, industry experts and FDA experts working on this ICD lead example and everything related to developing virtual patient and analysis. And then we had FDA folks in the team, but completely blinded from the development part as the review team. And we had a mock submission with these groups and came out with very good feedback, which is again available through MDIC's website under resource section. So if you're thinking about virtual patient methodology, we have a lot of resources available.
Great. Thank you, Ted and Jatish, for answering that. We have several questions coming in. So the next one here is asking how to perform data management and measure the data quality of real-world data. What data checks need to be done before applying for external evidence methods? I think it's a complicated question to answer here, because really it depends on a lot of factors that need to be considered to assess the relevance and reliability of the data. There is no one solution to it that would fit to all different data sources. But in aspects of applying statistical methods, I would say that, information on baseline covariates is critical if you have to, for example, apply propensity score methodology. And having information on all key baseline covariates, which are clinically important, is a key component. So if, for example, your external data source has data on only some of those key covariates and others that are required or important from clinical perspective are not there, then that may be a concern, because now you're building a model based on only some covariates. To be able to use propensity score methodology and to be able to say that it mimics a randomized controlled trial setup, you need to be able to incorporate all key covariates into your model. So that would be one check in a way of your data, to make sure whether the methodology that you're applying can be appropriately applied given the covariates present. That's one take on it. I would like if others would like to add more to this, please.
Yes, that's for sure that the evaluation of data quality, including relevance and reliability, is a teamwork. Teamwork of clinicians, engineers, epidemiologists, and statisticians. If you have too many missing data, that may not be good. So yeah, when I talk about missing data, I refer to missing data in baseline covariates and in clinical outcomes. So yeah, it's a teamwork. We should get together, then figure out whether the data are fit for purpose or not, whether we have a sufficient relevance and reliability or not. Yeah, that's, yeah. Definitely we work with the sponsors to get as much information as possible from sponsors. Then we are going to do assessment of data quality.
And I'll put two other quick things to consider for folks, two different references. So one of which is there's the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, another public-private partnership, which does a pretty good job of coordinating activities relative to MDIC. And from CITI, the acronym CTTI, they did some work on randomized registry trials. And in the supporting documents for that, you can go to the CITI homepage, look for projects, what we do. You can pull up this registry trials working group. There's a pretty good discussion around items that you'd want to check and how do you look at. And this is in the context of working with registries to embed a trial in. But that's a subset of real world data, and it applies to this question of, well, what checks would you want to do? What would you be concerned with? So there's some good reference materials there. And the other thing I'll point to, again, the FDA has a great suite of reference documents. And one of the guidance documents is with real world data, real world evidence. And one of the things they point out there for the data quality, which I think is a real key element, is that the data quality is a function of the decision to be made on it, right? The same data source could have more than sufficient quality to be used for post-market surveillance, and yet not have enough quality to be used to expand indication, right? So quality is not a static attribute. It's something that depends upon the application. What do you want to do with the information? Is it enough? Is the quality good enough for that application? This goes back to, find out about this by good interactions between industry and FDA.
Yeah, I would like to add that I think that comment is very important. It goes down to, is the data fit for purpose? What is the purpose, the regulatory purpose at hand? And then you can answer the question. In addition to those good reference, I will also say that the very own MDIC framework for methodology and for data quality is a good step towards trying to more systematically standardize what that really means. But like quality is a moving variable depending on the question at hand. I think RWE as a new way of doing clinical studies or developing clinical evidence is also evolving. So we anticipate that these frameworks are going to be revised and updated, and so maybe the guidance from the FDA when we have more knowledge gained through real applications.
Great points. Thank you, Lily, Ted, and Pablo for that insight. There is a related question here. Are there specific sources of real-world data that have been verified and considered reliable source of external data for specific disease areas? Would anybody like to weigh in on that?
That is very closely tied to that prior question.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and like there's some analyses I've seen that came out of the Smith Center up in Boston. This having to do with transcatheter aortic valves, and one of the things they had found that was for the data around that, like two of the endpoints they looked at were stroke and mortality. And what they found was that the findings from, I believe it was claims, I have to go back and check, but if you were to compare trial findings from claims finding, the mortality signal was very consistent, right? But when you compared the stroke findings between the trial and the claims data, they were actually diverged, right? And there can be reasons for billing why you might classify the rate of strokes in a claims database differently from the rate of strokes you would use in a clinical trial, right? So I'm just highlighting that as an example where sometimes the same data set can in fact be differentially useful depending upon the endpoint you're looking at. So I don't think we're likely to be in a situation anytime soon where we can put a stamped seal of approval on a data set and say, this is good to go for all uses. There are some where probably prior work has been done on, and certainly many of the data sets that the NEST Coordinating Center and MDIC work on are well positioned to that. But it's still, at the end of the day, this question of fit for purpose, for that particular data, sometimes even for that particular endpoint, is it appropriate for what you want to do?
Thank you, Ted. So we have one more question here, and it's relating that it's asking the question, how does this framework coordinate with the FDA's artificial intelligence and machine learning software as a medical device action plan of January 2021, and the proposed regulatory framework for modifications to artificial intelligence machine learning based software as a medical device? Are the methods proposed in the MDIC framework deemed to constitute good machine learning practice as referenced in the action plan? Lily, would you like to start with that? I'm still thinking about it.
I see this question should be answered by Jitesh and Pablo.
Would like to take a stab at answering it first.
I can briefly comment, of course. I don't think they are not directly connected because the SAMD and AML action plans are from the Digital Health Center for Excellence at FDA. It focuses on very specific things about AML, but the EEM framework, as Ted and Vandana just mentioned, is more focused on the statistical methodologies of leveraging data. But so now, if the framework in the AML proposes something where you can generate the data, then bring it to one of the methods we have here, that might be relevant. But I just want to add one thing here, slightly related to this. The framework here is not specific to devices alone, but it's also applicable to diagnostics. Vandana or Ted, can you remind the group that whether we have some examples from diagnostics side in the framework?
Yes. Yes, so it doesn't, so most of the methods we have seen applications of it in the therapeutic device area, but certainly it's applicable as well to the diagnostic device area as well. And we did include one example of diagnostic device in the 7 examples that I was mentioning earlier, as well as a paragraph or so describing the use of external data for devices, for diagnostic devices specifically. So certainly it covers both areas, therapeutic and diagnostic.
And those who are looking for resources, I think Ted just mentioned about NEST frameworks, and even Pablo in his presentation, all these documents, for example, NEST data quality framework, NEST data methods framework, they are available freely to all the stakeholders and they are connected to this framework. Similarly, MDIC has recently released an IVD real world evidence framework. Again, this is going to be complementary to that. And all these frameworks are available freely to access anybody who wishes to so. Back to you, Vandana.
All right, thank you, Jitesh. I don't see any more questions coming in here, so I think we'll almost at the top of the hour. We'll wrap up our session now. I really appreciate everybody's input. Panel members, thank you so much for your contributions, your presentations, as well as answering and addressing questions from our audience today. We look forward to comments coming in on the EEM framework document. As we said, it's open for public comments until February 22nd. So please provide any comments, and we look forward to looking at them and providing more feedback and continuing the work here. So with that, I would like to thank. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Vandana, I'd like to add something. For the upcoming FDA advanced statistical workshop scheduled in May, we are going to continue to discuss EEM framework. So yeah, please keep your questions. In that workshop, we can have further discussions.
Thank you, Lily.
Great.
And we will make sure that the recording of this webinar will be available on MDIC website in a couple of days. With that, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.